Hello, my name is Koerner. I'm working with the United Nations Environment Programme. I'm part of the Sustainable Mobility Unit where I'm coordinating UNEP's electric mobility program. Today, I want to go with you over a couple of slides which are dealing with the integration of energy and mobility in low and middle income countries. Integrating energy and mobility, what does it mean? First of all, when we are talking about EVs here in this context, we are not talking about electric cars only, but we are actually also very much looking for electric 2 and 3 wheelers and electric buses. That is an important remark because in many circumstances, the moment you're talking about electric mobility, everybody thinks about electric cars. And actually also many people using electric cars in their slides, which is why we are seeing them here. But it's more than this. It's 2 and 3 wheelers, it's buses, it's all sort of vehicles. So now electric vehicles establish a physical link between two energy sectors, which is the power sector and the transport sector. So in the past, these two sectors, they did not have so many things in common, but with e-mobility, these two sectors will be very closely linked. Because EVs do not only use electricity, but can also provide services to the grid. The capacity of EVs to store electricity and the possibility to control the time of EV charging, for example through smart grids, or much easier and much less technology intense through differentiated tariffs, can contribute to better match power supply and demand. Matching power supply and demand is a great concern, especially when it comes to the integration of variable renewable power, where we see peaks in supply and also peaks in demand. And now what we generally want to do is to align supply and demand. Two buzzwords out of this space are, for example, peak shaving or load shifting. Now, significant fleets of EVs can contribute to a better integration of variable renewable power generation because they basically allow for storing electricity or controlling the time when electricity off the grid is used, or even feeding back electricity into the grid. Power generation capacity needs to be dimensioned in a way that it can cope all the time with peak demand. Demand peaks for electricity usually occur during the morning and the evening hours, when people go to work and come back from work, and when a lot of electric appliances are used in private households. The difference between peak capacity and off-peak capacity is shown in this graph for the International Energy Agency's Sustainable Development Scenario for the year 2030 for a couple of main electric vehicle markets. For example, if you look at the graph and if you compare the left side to the right side, then you will see that the difference between off-peak and peak capacity in China is projected to amount to about 250 gigawatts. Now 250 gigawatts is the equivalent to about 250 large conventional power plants, or about 100,000 wind turbines of 2.5 megawatts power output each. While during off-peak hours, renewable power generation is expected to account for about 25% of power generation in China under this scenario, and this is shown by the light green bar on the right side of the graph, peak power capacity is likely to still be dominated by fossil fuels, because for peak power capacity you need something flexible, for example gas turbines. So even in the year 2030, it is very likely that peak power is much more dirtier than the actual off-peak power is. The dark green bar on the left side shows how much of the peak power could be actually covered through vehicle-to-grid service. And if you compare this for all the regions or the countries shown in this graph, then you'd see that vehicle-to-grid services could actually cover the entire difference between off-peak and peak capacity in the main EV markets. So now, according to this scenario by the IEA, peak power capacity of 600 gigawatts could be leveraged by vehicle to grid, which over the entire year could equal the entire power demand of Italy. So therefore, e-mobility is really a significant means of making the power system much cleaner, because it can shift, or it can help shift, cleaner off-peak power to times of peak power demand. Interesting applications for the integration of electric mobility and the power sector do not only exist in industrialized countries, but do also exist in low and middle income countries around the world. For example, the integration of electric 2- and 3-wheelers within renewable power, micro or mini grids in countries with poor power supply and low access rate to grid electricity can actually be very interesting. Very interesting business models can be established to enhance the profitability of these microgrids and to at the same time provide local transport sector with a clean and affordable fuel. The integration of e-mobility can also support unlocking renewable power generation capacity in small island development states. So very often these island power grids are dominated by the use of diesel gensets for power generation, and this often comes in combination with monopolistic power markets where independent power producers are not allowed to sell electricity to the grid. Now, of course, there need to be reforms to allow independent power producers to use the distribution grid. But once this sort of prerequisites are in place, electric mobility and the storage capacity and the capacity to control the demand for electricity from electric mobility can help equalize the profiles, the use profiles of electricity in small island development states, and it can therefore play an important role to enable the introduction of significant shares of renewable power in these island grid systems. Last but not least, e-mobility can support the integration of reliable renewable power generation in countries with power markets dominated by high shares of unflexible power generation capacity, such as hydro and nuclear power. In these countries, significant shares of electric vehicles could finally provide the much needed flexibility in energy demand to combine reliable renewable power generation with large amounts of base load. The next slide is about the integration of electric 2- and 3-wheelers in solar micro and mini grids in Africa. That could, for example, be based on battery swapping systems for electric 2- and 3-wheelers. Now, in case of a battery swapping application, the battery, which is actually quite expensive, is not sold together with the motorcycle, and the driver of the motorcycle, the owner of the motorcycle, does not own the battery, but the battery is owned by a swapping company which fills up batteries and which rents out the filled up battery. So in this case it's actually very good, because the electric motorcycle suddenly becomes quite cheap. Now, for example, for these mini grid applications, batteries could be charged using very simple direct current to direct current charging systems. And of course, this all benefits great times from the huge cost improvements, from the cost reductions we've been seeing for solar panels over the last years. Now, these batteries used in the motorcycles or in the electric 2- and 3-wheelers, they could also be used as storage, as energy storage for applications such as lighting, electronic devices, etc. So at the end of the day, electric 2- and 3-wheelers with modular batteries which can be removed from the vehicles are really truly connecting mobility and energy services. That is good on the mobility side, but it is also good on the mini grid operator side. And I would say that mini grid operators are really some sort of ideal operators for battery swapping systems. Now, why is that? First of all, since the power is produced by the mini grid operator itself, The power comes at production costs, so there's no need to pay an additional margin to the power provider. Now, since transportation based on electric 2- and 3-wheelers could significantly increase the demand for electricity, that also means that the utilization rate for the mini-grid is improved, which is good. And last but not least, the drivers of the electric 2- and 3-wheelers, they would be in a position to have access to clean and cheap fuel, which is electricity. Now, UNEP is already implementing electric motorcycle demos in Kenya, Uganda, and soon, hopefully, in Ethiopia. And now we are also very actively exploring to connect these electric 2- and 3-wheeler demonstration projects with charging and grid integration. The next slide is on a case study on Antigua and Barbuda, where we have a project to demonstrate electric buses, taxis, and how this can be integrated with solar power generation. Now, if you look at Antigua and Barbuda, currently power is almost entirely generated through 5 big diesel genset power stations with a total capacity of about 100 megawatts. Now, peak power demand is estimated at 51 megawatts, so really there's a very high surplus generation capacity to ensure stable supply. This, together with high fuel costs, actually cause very high costs of electricity of about 40 US dollar cents per kilowatt hour. In such a small island system, it's pretty difficult to integrate high shares of renewable power, because there's no geographical spread which could leverage between times of low wind or times of low solar among a big area, and there's also no grid integration with a huge transmission and distribution grid. So it's really an island system, and normally in such a system, if there are no other sources of flexibility, curtailment will increase significantly with increased renewable power supply. And this is what is shown on the graph. This graph shows the installed solar power generation on the x-axis and the percentage amount of total energy demand covered by the various power generation capacities in that graph. So if you jump directly to the right side, at an installed solar power generation capacity of 55 megawatts, about 78% of the electricity demanded in Antigua and Barbuda would still be covered by diesel gensets. About 22% of the electricity demand in Antigua and Barbuda would be covered by solar PV, but then 4% of the actual electricity produced would need to be also curtailed. So basically that red bar, which shows the amount of electricity which could not be fed into the grid and therefore would need to be curtailed, this amount of electricity increases significantly with increased solar PV generation capacity. At the same time, these islands are pretty ideal for e-mobility applications. People are driving low mileages per day, and we have a very high solar radiation and very often also very constant winds. So actually electric mobility and renewable power generation find pretty much ideal preconditions there. So for that reason, vehicle-to-grid services can actually play a key role in enabling the integration of variable renewable sources of power in grid island systems, because they can bring the flexibility which is needed to align supply and demand. This can be done through storing of electricity in electric vehicles, but this can be also done through actively controlling at which time electric vehicles are being charged. Now, a key precondition to make e-mobility and vehicle-to-grid services a reality in small island development states is that independent power producers are allowed to have access to the grid and are allowed to sell their power into the grid. Now, very often this is not yet the case, but this is also a target of some of our projects to actually change regulation in a way that independent power producers can sell electricity to the national grids. As already said, UNEP is implementing a project piloting the integration of electric taxis, buses and solar power supply in Antigua and Barbuda, and we are looking forward the results of these projects.